And it worked. You know, Chance the Rapper is one of the biggest selling artists of all time, you know, without a record label. And his messages and his power, you know, I would argue lay in the fact that he said, I don't want those things. I don't want to sign with anybody. I want to be able to just stand on my own 2 feet. You know, I told you about graffiti, and now, you know, you pay $300 to get into, you know, some museum to see a Futura piece that was torn down from the Bronx in 1982. You know, like, you know, all of a sudden they're legitimizing it, and it's like art now. But it was, you know, it was far more powerful and artistic when it first came out. You know, there's this return to seeing the medium, right, rap, hip hop, sampling, graffiti, as the major vehicle, and there's also an appreciation for those things as standalone things. Right, and there's a lot of appreciation and support right now for indie artists, for people who are using, you know, their own 2 feet and their own sweat equity to get the message out. And so, you know, there's a big movement in that, and I'm really sort of appreciative to have been there at the start of that. And also to see the power that lays in being able to not be co-opted. You know, a lot of what you know, tons of panelists have spoken about the way that news gets co-opted and then turned into what you're supposed to hear, what you're supposed to listen to. I would say that if you take the time, there's a ton of black art in particular in the graffiti world, in the hip hop world, that's spreading news that is really, really important, and is really highlighting a lot of the stuff that, you know, our kids are going through. There's speaking of kids, I want to end with this. There's this, how many of you are familiar with the genre of reaction videos? Yeah, so reaction videos are super meta. So the idea is that someone's watching something and you're watching them watch the thing, okay? And it's very 2019. But my favorite is there's this group of kids, these young black kids from the suburbs who are called We Watch Old School Videos. And they sit and they watch old rap videos from the 80s, and then they talk about it between each other, right? And it's beautiful. It's an incredible, incredible thing to watch, but it's also, you're watching the education and the news and the history and the lessons. Like, they're proving you don't need teachers, you don't need books, you don't need curricula, you don't need to be tested. You just need an interesting format, and you need interest and engagement, right? And these kids, man, these videos are wild. The one I just saw this morning, because it just came out, was they watched LL Cool J Rock the Bells. And in that video, LL runs around the city with no shirt on and a big-ass gold chain, and he's looking for his girlfriend because she's been kidnapped. And he does all sorts of wild stuff, like he jumps on tables and he raps, and then he jumps off tables and he raps. And he, jumps on a car and he raps. And in the end, he finds his girlfriend, he beats up the bad guys. These kids are losing their mind watching this video, because the video is juxtaposed in a corner, and then there you see their face, and and it's such a beautiful, incredible, sort of full circle return to, like, that's the news for us. It's always been in, that spreading the word, that spoken word, like the young brother who was up here at lunch, you know what I mean? Like, that's the news. I mean, we could buy books and we can, like, do all that stuff, and those things are awesome. They're dope. I love books. But, like, like, the truth of the matter is that, like, if we let people say what they want to say and do it in the manner that they're going to do it without saying to them that the outcome has to be you sell the thing, we get a lot more truth, right? And so that's how I just want to end by saying that a lot of the alternative news that we're seeing across these platforms are driven by youngsters who aren't interested in making money. They're not interested in getting signed anymore. They're not interested in you knowing them. They're gonna wake up tomorrow and they're gonna make another reaction video, whether you watch it or not. And that's the kind of stuff happening all around you in your communities. There's a little kid next door to you right now, working on his SoundCloud rap. You know what I mean? Like, make sure that we, keep that news going by supporting these young brothers and sisters, and not saying, like, well, in our days, we did this and we did that. And it's like, well, in the 80s, they were saying, well, in our days, we did this. Somebody's always saying that. If we can sort of make sure that they have the platforms, the space, the means, and the wherewithal to do that stuff, we should be the ones to support them, and we should be the ones to empower them to do so and get out of the way, and not try to get involved, not try to co-opt, because then we can keep that news going, and then 40 years from now, another kid's gonna get up and be like, I remember when I was graffitiing all over New York. You know what I mean? At some conference in New Hampshire. Yeah, I think I'll end there. Thank you.
I think they set me up. How do I go after Mosart into Ramsey Harris? Awesome. All right, well, my name is Ramsey Harris. I'm a cultural and heritage interpreter. I'm originally from California. Been spending some time in Denver interpreting some parks and programs there, but my passion is art, and I fell in love with the Black Panther Party newspaper about 15 years ago when I was a disillusioned art student. And I just needed some context, because that's what we do as interpreters. We build emotional connections and context with what we are looking at and what we are learning. And so I wanted to start with a short video. We watched Stanley Nelson yesterday, and we're going to watch him again today, which is, I guess somebody got the memo. And so we're gonna learn about the Black Panthers, and then we're gonna look at some images, and I wanna talk to you a little bit about what those images meant to interpret a cultural revolutionary movement.
Cultures, where a group of blind men approach an elephant and try to describe it. The first man approaches the elephant, touches its side, and says, it feels like a wall. The next man touches the tusk and says, the elephant must be like a spear. Another blind man touches the trunk and says, it feels like a snake. And that is quite often what happens with our descriptions of the Black Panther Party. We know the party we were in, and not the entire thing. We were making history, and it wasn't nice and clean. It wasn't easy, it was complex.
The thing that led to the Panthers was what we were seeing on television every day: attack dogs, fire hoses, bombing.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers.
Now we have the emergence of voices within the community that were saying we're not going to continue to turn the other cheek.
You tell them white folk in Mississippi that all the scared niggas are dead. We want black power. We want black power.
This was a revolutionary time. 50 countries in the world gained their independence in the decade before the founding of the Black Panther Party. This is the time when people are getting drafted to go and fight in Vietnam. So if somebody's coming and saying, well, if you're going to fight, why not fight right here in LA or Oakland? You know, that made a lot of sense.
You couldn't be absent and see what we saw. You couldn't unsee it. I was a cocktail waitress in a white strip club 2 years before I joined the Black Panther Party. How did that happen? The rage was in the streets. It was everywhere.
We're not gonna get nothing. Not by sitting around here doing these city demonstrations and nothing. People not gonna do anything.
Well, how are we going to do it?
By violence. Violence. By uprising, having a revolution. Just put blood, you know, let everybody bleed a little bit.
Thank you. All right, the Black Panther newspaper. Okay. Sorry. Can I have someone help me with the, it's not. There's two, hold on. Wrong one, okay. Okay, so the goal of the Black Panther newspaper was to highlight not just the movement and the ideology of the Black Panther Party, but it was also used to convey hope and a message of what the Black Panther Party wanted to happen within the community that they were trying to change. They had community survival programs, free breakfast for children programs, and that free breakfast for children program was the first ever program that was given to a community without federal aid, the first one. We don't think about that now because I think we're focused on so much of our own nonprofits and things that we're trying to help, which is what we need, but we forget that they came from somewhere. They actually came from somewhere, and they came from community dependency within themselves. And they were the first ones to actually test for sickle cell anemia as well within their medical clinic. And 60% of the Black Panther Party by its end of 1980 was 60% female. And it was very important to highlight that because what that showed was that they were trying to not only depend on black men with guns, but they wanted to highlight that females had a place within the party, and it wasn't just behind a desk answering a phone or raising the children. They were an essential aspect to the party, and they knew women would help the party grow and also help the community grow as well. The 10-point program of the Black Panther Party was the foundation of the party itself and also the platforms that they worked for. There's 10 of them there if you want to just glance over them and read them. They were the focus of every single newspaper. You would find that in the back or in the middle of every Black Panther newspaper for the 13 years that it was in print. So if you ever questioned what the Black Panther Party wanted, read those 10 points. They're right there. And they are so relevant today. I think if you were to look at them and read through them, I think we're still asking for some of the same things in our community, aren't we? It's a bit of a challenge to read that because you would think of all of the change and all of the progression that we are trying to make and have made. We are still reading those 10 points and saying, wait, what about number 2 and 3? We're still waiting. Emory Douglas was born in San Francisco, California, about an hour away from where I was born in Sacramento. And Emory Douglas learned his trade as a graphic designer in prison as a juvenile. When he got out, he met up with Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party, on a college campus and was like, you know what, I can help you. So I have this vision of this kid, he's around 19, 20. He's like, wait, let me help you with your newspaper. So he goes back home and he grabs all his stuff. He took too long, because I can imagine what it must have looked like back in the 60s, trying to grab all your graphic art stuff, carrying them back to campus and saying, let me help you with your paper. And they were like, let me hear your ideas. So he became the official Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. And what he did changed everything for their paper. Because at first when the paper came out, they did it in segments, just small little isolated segments without images. But he realized that when we were working with a community that was illiterate and very short on time and education, he knew he had to do something that was never done before. He had to focus on images, and he had to focus on them for the people, by the people. So this is a quote that talks about what he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do for the people is that he wanted to show that they were the heroes in the story. That if you were a black person in the community at that time, odds are in the press, you were pretty probably a lot of what we are in the press right now. Being killed by the police, stealing something, or you're second class, third class, fourth class, fifth class. You are not the hero. But he realized with the Black Panther newspaper that he had a chance to show the community that they are the heroes. They were the ones who were winning, and they had a voice. And he wanted to reflect that in his artwork. All power to the people. Does this image look familiar to you? Yeah. Thank you, Jerry Ann girl. Thank you. I saw that, I almost teared up. I'm like, Emory Douglas, there he is, right there on the cover. Yep. All power to the people, not some power to the people. All power to the people. And if you look at this image, it's a little boy carrying the newspaper. He has a gun on his back. That is a gun. but he's shouting. Because they would go around the streets carrying the newspaper, selling it for about 25 cents. And he wanted to show in this image, this was a layout, that our youth are here too, and they are ready to fight, because it is all power to the people. And he wanted to show them screaming it. This was intentional. The mouth is open, he is yelling it. It is an intentional verbaling of what they wanted to say. And that gun on his back, the youth were taught to fight. Fight for your rights. Fight for your power to be here. You are not forgotten. It is you that we are building this party from. And he wanted to show that in this image. And these two images here, the one on your right, I'm like looking at that on your right, this was taken during printed out during the Vietnam War. Free the GIs. If you look in the helmet, you can see images of police. They're arresting a black man. They're on the streets, the marches. They have their guns. They're empowering the crowd. Our fight is not in Vietnam. What does that mean? Our fight is here at home. Free the GIs, because we are sending our black men, our black brothers over to another land, and we are not free here. And it's in the helmet for a reason, and he's crying. There are tears in his eyes. Because he knows up here what's happening. But he's still carrying that gun on his back for the United States Army. He's still sending off to war, and he's crying because he is not free. But it wasn't all pessimistic. He still wanted to show that there was hope. We look in the child's eyes on the other print. One eye, if you can see, there's a free breakfast for children. They're eating, and they're smiling. They're happy. They're getting the essential nutrients before they go to school. It is a need, a central need for us to eat. Breakfast is the important meal of the day. We've heard our whole lives. There they are getting fed, and they're happy about it. And they are being fed by their people. And in his other eye, there's a nurse taking care of a little girl. Their needs are being met. They are whole, and the child is smiling, and there are sun rays coming out of the back of his head. He purposely put patterns on his hat to highlight the different various ways that we are conditioned in our society, and he wanted to show the patterns to reflect that our emotions are varied, that our happiness varies, but it's still there, and it can still sit on the top of our heads. And it says, we shall survive without a doubt. In the other image here, we are showing children carrying the newspaper. And these are actually images on your right of they're going into the state capitol in California, in Sacramento, California. In the late 60s, the Black Panthers went into the state capitol in Sacramento to fight the Mulford Act. It was the Panther bill. And it was the only bill to this day that the NRA has ever stood behind for gun control. Yep. Interesting. Yeah. Yep. They are like, what's happening? These are too many black people with guns. We have to end this. They went into the Capitol. They were not loaded. But can you imagine that scene today? I couldn't even imagine it. I couldn't imagine it. But the pride they felt, though. The pride that they felt. And so they have these children here. They're carrying the paper. But look what's happening to these kids. They're being searched before they go into the Capitol. In my mind, when I see this image, it's 2019. Because have you been to schools where you have to go through metal detectors to get your the math class, right? Foreshadowing of something more. In the next image, she has a woman standing up on top of rats and a table. This is her house. We have a picture of Huey Newton in the back. She's representing. She has hope. She's fighting. She might be on that table, but she is fighting. It's her house. This is where she lives, and this is where she belongs. And she's going to fight. Again, the hero. Might be at the bottom for now, but just for now. There's hope. And here we have two images of men, and the one that I like to really highlight is the one on your right. All the weapons we used to use against each other we now use against the oppressor. In the background, we see he's turning his back, but now he's facing us. Now ready to fight, not each other. We're not fighting each other now. We are fighting for the freedom that we want on the outside. And he purposely used on the other image, on the right-hand side, the lines to highlight jail cells. He used lines a lot in his images. But look, he's in front of the lines, right? He's in front of the lines. He is no longer behind them. And this is actually one of my favorite images. Vote for Survival, free food program. You can see that she has a hole in her shirt and her jacket, but she's carrying food from her community organization, and she is smiling. She is happy because she knows that she is a part of something bigger, and she voted for that survival, to survive. She didn't vote to die, she voted to survive. And she's out there picketing, getting her needs to survival, and she is moving on. This image to me shows me so much hope. When I see the look on that woman's face, it gives me comfort. And two more here, just highlighting a little bit of what he liked to talk about at the time. Beef halves, 59 cents, back in 59 cents back then was a lot. But we're just like, 59 cents, what? But at the end, it was a lot. And so showing the struggle of what's happening, hard times. And then there's Gerald Ford, and he is the puppet. It says that down there that he is the puppet. And you can see the different logos, Pan Am, Allstate, Ford, highlighting all the different organizations that at the time pocketed the presidency, right? Who's in charge? Who are we serving? Who's really the president of the United States? And then we have here, all power to the people, with the guns pointing to the pig. Pigs were the police. And he looks very confused because he can't figure out how those guns turned on him, right? And then we have another mother, and she's in tribal clothing, and she's holding her child with a gun, and she is ready to defend. She is ready to defend. She is ready to go. And it's showing that we are no longer afraid. These images are showing that we are about hope and fighting for who we are. And as we look at these images, I like to think, now what? Image on the right, 1969. Black Lives Matter, this was taken last year. We are in the same predicament. Some of those articles that were written in the Black Panthers newspaper are so relevant today, it brings tears to my eyes. I've been a community activist for the Denver chapter of the Black Lives Matter for about 6 months. And the rise of police brutality in Denver and the surrounding area, especially Colorado Springs. We just had a shooting, shot in his back. I mean, the things that we have to deal with 50 years later should tell us how relevant this alternative press is. It's alternative because we're not, we don't get to go to the local paper shop and buy it. But it's not alternative to our lives. It is our lives. This is where we are today. And we have to move forward. We have to take what we know to have been and know that it is still here. It has not gone away. Somebody asked me the other day, why do I think the Black Panther Party failed? And I know I only have a couple more, probably maybe no more seconds. And I said, it didn't fail. It didn't fail. It just wasn't successful in the way that it wanted to be for the time. But who said it failed? We could still move on. We can still fight for it. Black Lives Matter. We still have free breakfast for children programs. We still have a freedom school. We are still doing the same things that the Black Panther Party did, except we don't have our guns anymore, but that's okay. We can fight in other ways, because that's really what it was about. So when they asked me, what do I think happened? I think when Huey Newton was in jail for 3 years, when the party was really getting off to a start, I think it hurt the party. It was hard for them. But I don't think it failed. I just think it just didn't go in the way that it wanted it to. So if I could leave you with anything, I would like to share with you a chant that we do. This is the Asada chant that we do for our Black Lives Matter program. At the end of every meeting, and when we do our Freedom School, we say this chant. And I would like, if you could, to repeat after me, after the first line, the second, third, and the fourth. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and protect each other.
We must love and protect each other.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Okay, so my PowerPoint is up there. If I go like this, I can actually sort of see what's going on a little bit. Thank you all for staying to, I think, the very last, the last paper of the conference. And also thank you for the organizers for not having a podium that's bigger than I am, which sometimes happens. I'm just gonna, okay, so my talk today is called A Mighty Power, Print Photography and the 19th Century African American Subject. The picture-making faculty Frederick Douglass wrote in 1861 is a mighty power because it allowed individuals to make, he says, their subjective nature objective. Douglass believed in the ability of pictures and photographs to demonstrate the inherent humanity of African Americans. Yet Douglass was also aware, and as we've seen here today, that pictures and illustrations have been used to dehumanize African Americans, and he strove to counteract that tendency. So when I saw the call for papers for this topic, for this conference, Black Ink, I was really excited to think about the role of pictures and illustrations in print sources by African American publishers or editors from the 19th century, since I work in the 19th century. What role did African American print publications play in the process of creating more positive images of African American identity in the 19th century? I was also really curious about the rise of photography of African Americans, such as Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, and how this might function as a rebuttal to the fairly pitiful representations of African Americans in the dominant press. So in my brief time today, I will focus on three topics. First, visual representations of African Americans in mainstream print publications. And I'll go through that part pretty quickly in the 19th century because I think we could probably guess what they're like. Second, visual representations of African American in African American newspapers in the pre- and post-Civil War period. And then photographs of people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth that were widely distributed and functioned as an important corrective to the lack of positive images of African American in print publications. So, let's see. My first topic has to do with print publications by the mainstream press. And the first representations of African Americans that we get are in abolitionist journals, and they have as the goal abolishing slavery. But so the main focus is on representing African Americans as abject, pitiful, broken, brutalized. And I'll just go through those fairly quickly. I'm sure many of you have seen images like this. So the first one I have here is from the Anti-Slavery Record, which is an abolition newspaper, an abolition almanac, and this is from 1835. It's an image of a woman being beaten, and she's huddled over. Very similar image in the Anti-Slavery Almanac from 1838 of a slave being tortured. So then we move forward to something like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, which is also an anti-slavery journal. And we have a lot going on in this illustration, and I don't really have time to talk about it all. I mean, we have a lot of representations of African Americans. This is the masthead to the journal, which I'm pretty interested in the mastheads themselves and what they connote. So it's the top line you see. And you know, there's a lot going on, but what you do see in the middle of the image is this fairly well-known image called the Supplicants Slave, which is an enslaved individual down on his hands and knees, shackled, looking up, and commonly the phrase that went with that is, "Am I not a man and a brother question mark. The slave saying, well, am I brother too or not? Garrison's The Liberator had other images, which I don't really have time to talk about here, but they're interesting. I'll show you one. This is from, I think, 1837, another image of an individual down on her hands and knees, but also being freed. And this continues in anti-slavery newspapers and almanacs into the 1840s. Another image, a woman who's actually being eaten by an eagle, American symbol there, who's kind of hovering over her body, clasping her child. This is pretty much what you get in abolitionist journals, these representations of African Americans as pitiful, broken. You get this a lot in mainstream newspapers as well. One really important exception, which I just started looking at recently, is Frank Leslie's Illustrated Journal, and this is this is 1857, Frank Leslie's Illustrated Journal from June 27th, 1857. And this is Dred Scott and Dred Scott's family. And so Frank Leslie had a really well-known 19th century illustrated newspaper, and I think he went out of his way to try to portray African Americans in more dignified postures and to kind of give them more humanity than what we've seen in the abolitionist journals, or like what we might see in something like Harper's. So this is a Frank Leslie, and I'm going to skip that one. Which one is that? I'm sorry. This is Harper's, another Harper's Illustrated Journal. This is a weird illustration. I think this is called A Negro Showered to Death, and I think Frank Leslie in prison. And I think he's trying to bring attention to the cause of brutality against African American prisoners. But again, it has this image of, I'm sorry, that's not Frank Leslie, that's Harper's. That's also Harper's. I can't quite see the screen too. There's challenges of being short. Can't see the screen, can't see the podium. But anyway, one more image, and this is actually another Harper's Bazaar magazine famous image. Gordon was a slave who escaped, and this was in Harper's Weekly newspaper, and he escaped, and he had been beaten. And there's a couple images of Gordon there. You can see one, he's in uniform, and he actually fought in the Union Army, and that's on the far side. And another as he entered, as he was found and examined by a medical examiner. But in the middle, the image that's foregrounded is Gordon's scarred back. And this became a very famous image in the 19th century, and it circulated on these postcard type things called carte de visite. People were fascinated with this image, and I believe Toni Morrison also refers to it in Beloved, but that's another story. So what we see in general with white print publications, no surprise, with the possible exception of Frank Leslie, is this representation of African Americans as abject, beaten, broken, tortured. For the most part, that's what's foregrounded. So when we turn to black print publications, there really are not that many fully illustrated African American newspapers, fully illustrated, until 1888, which is pretty late. But I have found some newspapers with illustrations earlier than that. One of them is the Colored American or Weekly Standard from 1837. And the Colored American, also called the Weekly Standard from 1837, has this really interesting masthead. And we talked a little about Garrison's masthead. This one is different because it shows a man who's kind of sitting and listening. And so the Colored American kind of went out of its way to get away from these images of African Americans as beaten and broken, at least on the masthead. Now, in the journal itself, the Colored American, the Weekly Advocate was the first name, and then when it came the Colored American in 1840, there are also illustrations in Colored American from various years. And this is one from 1840, and this is a pictorial illustration of the Bible. What I found really interesting about the illustrations in the Colored American was, for the most part, they don't depict people. They don't depict African Americans. It's often depictions of places. So we have here a depiction of the Capitol of Washington. And so I thought, well, maybe they just weren't into drawing people, and I kept looking at the archive, and then I did see this depiction of Benjamin Franklin, which I thought was really interesting. But within the pages of the Colored American, I don't think I found actually any illustrations of African Americans. So they seem to fixate on places rather than people. Douglas is the North Star. Oh yeah, that's another illustration from the Colored American that's kind of interesting. Douglas is the North Star sometimes had a masthead, which is quite interesting. It didn't always have this. And so yeah, I blew it up a little bit here so you could see what it really looks like. And it's a really interesting image of a slave running away. And he's following the North Star, and his back is towards the viewer, which I find really interesting. And that's 1840. You can find some images like that. So we have a pretty big jump here from Frederick Douglass's 1840 newspaper, rather 1850, from the North Star, and then to the first really well-known illustrated newspaper. Actually, this is the first fully illustrated newspaper called The Freeman in 1888. And this was edited by a guy named Edward Cooper, and he was a journalist, and he wanted this newspaper to be what he called, he took this fairly humble newspaper, and he wanted to make it into what he called the Colored Harper's Weekly. So the Freeman has really cool illustrations, and I put up there, putting up here a couple of mastheads from the Freeman, and the first one was what the journal first started with, and it is this supplicant slave image with a slave down on his hands and knees, and I think that's supposed to be Abraham Lincoln. But they changed that pretty quickly to the image you see below that of like liberty, but African American. So they changed the masthead pretty quickly. It's a really cool newspaper and really early experimenting with visual text. And this is an advertisement that I thought was really funny for the Freeman. Have you seen the Freeman? The Freeman had all kinds of stuff in it, like cartoons and illustrations, but it tried to portray African Americans in a very different way. This image here is of a famous African American tenor, and the Colored American puts him on the front cover. It also had political cartoons, which I won't talk about here, and anti-lynching cartoons, which are really, really interesting, but I won't talk about them here in the interest of time. The paper itself was really chock full of illustrations. You can see like what a sample page looked at, and there's so many illustrations on one page. So that's really interesting. In any case, we do see a rather large gap here between Black print's ability to control visual representations of African Americans up until the late 1880s. Like I said, with Frederick Douglass, then there's this kind of gap. And so this gets into the third subject of photography. Photography is a really big deal in the mid-19th century, and a lot of people have talked about it, but I suggest that photography was a way in which African Americans counteracted the visualization of themselves as pitiful that was really common in the mainstream press, with the possible exception of Frank Leslie. And Douglass himself, Frederick Douglass himself, as many of you may know, was actually the most photographed US individual in the 19th century. He had more photographs taken of him than Lincoln. And he was the most photographed US individual in the 19th century. And in most of these images, he refuses to smile for the camera, in part because he believed that images of African Americans from the past had made them the subject of ridicule and caricature. And this is a really famous image of Douglass. And you can see he is he's kind of got a very stern expression on his face. He's very well dressed, and he's trying to counteract this idea of African Americans as downtrodden and completely abject. Sojourner Truth also used photography and images in a really powerful way throughout her career. And her images in particular were sold as these carte de visite. She made a lot of money by selling her images as these kind of postcards that people would buy and circulate. Her images are cool in a lot of different ways, but she plays with symbolic items in her photos. Here we see a photograph of her, but actually if you look at it closely, what do you notice on her lap? Can you tell what that is? Yeah, she's got a photograph, so it's like a photograph within a photograph, a meta photograph, you know, But this is a photograph of her grandson. It's like when you're watching TV and you see somebody watching TV, it makes you think about like, oh, how are they watching? I mean, it's to make us think about the power of visuality itself. And this is a photograph of her grandson, and he was a prisoner of war during the Civil War. This picture was taken between 1863 and 1865, and she did not know what had happened to him at this point. He did survive. She is using this in a powerful way. I think her inclusion of a grandson who is fighting on the Union side demands a type of recognition of her symbolic citizenship. And I love her outfit. I've seen a lot of comment on, is she wearing stripes with polka dots? I'm not so concerned about that, but I love the kind of grandiosity of her outfit. The picture within the picture of her grandson gives this photograph what I would call a meta-pictorial element. It's a picture about a picture, and makes the viewer aware of the artificiality of the photographic domain. Perhaps in including this image, she seeks to ask the viewer to reflect on the power of photography and the image not only to convey, quote, reality, but also as an instrument of creativity, artifice, and visual control. So in conclusion, I want to suggest here, that photographic work created by African Americans in freedom during the time period of 1850 to 1880s had a number of important goals. And a lot of people have talked about the photographic work, but not necessarily in relationship to print culture. I think one goal was certainly to create the platform for portraits of African American that were not pitiful, especially in the absence of a good forum for illustrated African Americans in print publications, such as newspapers. In other words, photography was an important mighty power. Photography, I argue, filled the gap, creating images of African Americans as literate, educated, and empowered in a time period when the mainstream press, I think with the possible exception of Frank Leslie, was wedded to images of African American as enslaved and or pitiful. Photography, I argue, filled a gap between non-illustrated and illustrated black newspapers in the years from 1850 to 1889 by allowing some African Americans, such as Douglass and Truth, to impact the way the nation viewed their race before such pictures could make their way into African American print publications. Thank you.
Okay, now is the time to have some conversations. Any questions from the audience?
Hi. My name is Joel McCall. This is going to be personal, and I don't know if it applies all the way around. I'm not really sure what my question is, but I'm trying to figure out my 15-year-old daughter. And there's something that I can't get over that kind of got my attention that I read somewhere about the younger generations, their input-output system, it being this small screen and having to scroll really far to get information and to process it and hold information. I feel, and I work with other young people, I feel like the younger generation is missing something about big picture and scale of things, whether it's history, it's events, it's all of that kind of stuff. And so I think this applies to all three of you, actually, because with the graphics of the Black Panther Party, having a big screen to look at that, and you're talking about the graffiti on the side of a train, the scale of being able to take in something big and then going into it. And then also the last piece where you're talking about the, a newsprint, a newspaper from the Reconstruction, you could, by accident read one article and then dive right into another one. But the kids today, they can't do that with this. So I'm not really sure what my question is, but can you speak to that? Are they missing something, or am I missing something?
It's a little bit of both.
I would say I agree, especially when you talk about how you're looking at the images, they're right there and they're larger. And the thing about that made the Black Panther newspaper so profound is that it was circulated through the community, not necessarily, it was circulated at will, but it was also circulated in a way that people waited for it. Like they were like, we know this information is out there. We're gonna wait for that new weekly edition to come out. They couldn't just say, oh, let me just grab my phone and start trying. It built. There's something to be said about adrenaline. There's something to be said about that that want for more, that want for gratification on an intellectual, spiritual, and social level. And I think that's what I would say that the newspaper did for the community, is it gave them, it was food for the soul. I mean, it was obviously something they could see and they could read, but it fed really the soul. It fed the intellect through the spirit. And it is very difficult, like you're saying, like with the younger generation, because everything, we always say they're so instantly gratified that sometimes when we don't have a couple of seconds to process information or process what it is that we're feeling, it does have an impact of that information that we get. Hopefully this is answering your kind of question. I see what you mean. We click well on how we communicate. So I think that is something that there's something to be said about that. That time, you read one edition and then you give it some time and then you formulate how you feel about it. You formulate your own opinion and your ideas and what that means to you, and then it comes to you again in a different way, in a new idea, new edition, new information built off the same platform. So yeah, I think not having that space and that moment, I think does affect how I think our younger generation is processing info, for sure.
So I'd like to start by saying that not understanding a 15-year-old is not unique to 2019. And so, I mean, I feel for you. I work with young kids. But also, I think that today's young kids are really maligned, have a bad rap, as they say. There are limitations to the phone, there are limitations to scrolling and all that, but at the same time, kids are creating more art now than they have ever been. They're more active now than they have ever been. They're leading movements in a way that, we haven't really seen that before. We've seen pockets of it, but we have kids right now leading everything and changing things, and they're the ones that are challenging us to have conversations about what is gender, what is sexuality. They're the ones that are having conversations that are forcing us to have conversations about addiction and about dependency. So I would say that it's really, really important for us to not let, sort of what we perceive to be ineffective modes of communication get in the way with understanding that these kids are communicating in a way that we have no grasp of, but we're also incapable of. People want to talk about memes all the time, and kids are into memes, and they're so silly and whatever, but memes are so deep. They rely on so much information. They rely on so much symbolism, and they rely on, there's a semiotics to them that's just unbelievable. And they're using them to communicate, to talk to one another, to problem solve. So I would say that, I would balance the urge of wanting to be supportive and, sharing things that we used in our days and that we value, again, like books and things like that, balance that with what kids are saying is important and what they're using and inventing.
Yeah. I also think the way we read has never really been static. I think in the 19th century, we read, for example, maybe not everybody was literate. Some people were reading out loud. Some people were reading chapters of books as they came out in novels, and newspapers. And I actually think there's been a fair amount of jumping around going on. Like the Colored American, some of the newspapers I'm looking at, you can see all these different illustrations on one page. And yeah, you can jump from place to place, which I think you're saying, but also, or you could read straight truth. So I think that's been going on for a while, and I still think people do that. Like when I'm on Wikipedia, I will say once in a while, I consult Wikipedia, right? I'll admit it, I'm a professor, but I always follow the footnotes out to where they're going to, see if they're real or not, or the information is made up. But, I'll see something about X, and then I'll be there's a hyperlink. And that's highlighted, and then I'll go there. And so I jump around too, and I do think our students are doing that. They may not be doing it in the same way we did it 30 years ago, but maybe they're doing it in a way 19th century readers did, where they passed around things. So I guess I think reading practices are always changing, and it may be that people in the 19th century were more used to getting snippets of news because so many people couldn't read. And in the Black community, reading was limited too. So, they may have got snippets of news from newspapers read out loud to them, and that, and the person, and I mean, I'm not a reader. I don't sit down and read like the New Yorker from page to page to page. I browse. I jump around a lot too. So, I mean, I think maybe we need to think a little bit more about what's changing and what's good and bad about that than, just saying, okay, well, it's definitely different, but is that necessarily completely different from anything we've ever seen in the past? I don't know.
I just want to give a quick plug and point out that the concept of hyperlinking is identical to the concept of sampling.
Yep.
The idea that you're inside of something, and you're able to come back and forth, but the sample is the link, so.
And memes, some of these things that I had up there, like the Supplicants Slave, that was a meme in the 19th century. Yeah. That was everywhere, that image of I'm not saying it's a good thing at all, but that, and Gordon, but yeah, it was on pottery, it was on bracelets, it was on aprons, it was everywhere. So, there's some overlap.
I just want to jump in with a question, if I might.
Yes. I think we can.
Because what you were talking about, what you all have been talking about is a lot beyond words. It's it's images. So I've wondered what is the importance of spreading the word, as Mo mentioned, that this is a way to spread the word, spread the news. So spreading of the news, and what is the responsibility of spreading the news to create social change?
You can't change something without there being some kind of energetic current to affect it. And news, north, east, west, south, right? Is that news spells out the directions.
What?
And
is that true?
Oh
yeah.
What? I never you learn something every day. And I didn't even have to hit a hyperlink to find that.
Wow.
Oh my God.
And so to get that the news, to follow those directions, you and to create that social change, it has to go the channels, right? It has to follow that current. And so you just have to have that outlet, whether it went from the petroglyphs, the hieroglyphic art, we start from one way and then we move into the future, and here we are with our hyperlinks and all the, with our technology. But that is how we communicate when we're not in front of each other. We're here today, but we all go our separate ways, and then we'll find each other on social media, or we'll find each other hopefully on a website and emails. But we won't, this space will eventually break apart, but we want to hold this space all the time, right? We want to hold what we know now and channel that into other ways of our lives and share it with others that we're going to encounter when we leave here. And so I think that's what happens with that, is that the news, the paper, the visual aids, that's all doing the same thing. It's just keeping it moving in a way that we feel is growth and to create that change.
When I was growing up in New York, there was a weird cold that was killing people. And then after a while, you realized it was killing men. And then after a while, you realized it was killing a particular group of men. And when my friends would sleep over, my mom wouldn't let them use my toothbrush to brush their teeth if they forgot it. Oh, wow. So we used to sneak into the bathroom and be like, yo, brush your teeth with my toothbrush, it don't matter, whatever, because my mom was watching the news, and the news was like, yo, you're gonna die. Drink some from another person's cup, you're gonna die. Cough in someone's face, you're gonna die. It was rap music that I turned to that helped me learn about, sexually transmitted diseases, about condoms, about promiscuity, all these concepts that no one else was talking to me about. And I do believe people are inherently good. People inherently want to help each other. And these artists were using their platforms to help and spread the truth. At the time, it was alternative news, or as we would say, fake news, but it turned out to be like, oh, it is true. These are the ways that these things get passed, not through coughing or rubbing hands. So I think that if we give people platforms, and I hope this answers your questions, I think that inherently they will use it to help each other and to inform one another.
my question's for Martha. I'm wondering about the message of victimhood and use of terms like that. If the words were actually used with the images, or if those definitions have been superimposed, because I think you could interpret those pictures in a different way if that's not stated.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, you know, the one I showed of a slave that's being, it's like, it says a slave being hung up and beaten. And, you know, that's really all there is on that. So, you know, we may be inserting our idea that this is a victimhood. But I think, you know, you can look at other imagings of slaves in other kinds of publications where people have stood up and broken off their own chains. And I prefer that kind of imaging and breaking away from this idea of passivity and lack of agency. And then the supplicant slave image really bugs me. Am I not a man and a brother, question mark. I really do see that as a kind of creation of this abject, pitiful individual who does, and he's down on his hands and knees, looking up usually to a white viewer, asking that question. And so I see that as a and I think the caption is really important there with the question mark as well, in terms of saying, like, this individual is not saying, there is another one where the individual is saying, I am a man, your brother. I mean, that could change it too. So it's also about the interaction between the words in the text and the illustrations. So yeah, I mean, we can't, I think sometimes we impose our own ideas of pictures alone are really, people always say picture's worth 1,000 words. It is, but it can be interpreted so many different ways. But I think when you look at the words surrounding those texts, then you get a clearer message of what the person is trying to convey.
For sure, but if you're showing an image of someone who's being brutalized in some way, that's certainly not a passive victim. It's someone caught in a circumstance and being brutalized, but not because they can't run away. It's the wrong term. Not that they're being passive.
Yeah, but the illustrator makes a choice to show that rather than, I mean, I have other texts I talk about in my book of slaves who are on horseback running away. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, that to me is less about this abject status and trying to show agency within the illustration itself and power and resistance. But, you know, it's not like, I do take your point that, you know, if we think about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a book that I really don't like, but I mean, I like it, but I have mixed feelings about it. But Uncle Tom is the perfect example of what you're saying, because he dies while being beaten, but one of the reasons he does that is he refuses to beat another slave. So I think what I hear you saying is there's a little bit of a false binary there between abjection, pitiful, and resistance that probably needs to be complicated, and I think that's a really good point.
But I'll just add to this, for me, it's also the emotion that the artist is trying to get from the reader. So, you know, what is that telling? Because it takes two people to read that image, you know? Right. So the person who's putting it there wants to portray a certain image of the person they're portraying. And the reader looks back. I mean, the images of the black man kneeling, saying, "Am I not a man?" is a totally different response than looking at the Black Panther image of the man with his gun on the back, say, "Yes, yeah. I'm a man." Mm-hmm. You know,
that's worked really well together.
Can I just add one comment about reaction? I would challenge us as a group of, especially a group of older educated folk, to really examine our reactions to the stuff we're hearing coming out of contemporary art and underground art, and really question if our anger and our indignation should be, you know, focused at the people saying the words or at the stuff they're saying. We spend a lot of time focused on the fact that someone used a swear word, or that they talk about violence, or that they talk about, you know, bad stuff, right? Rather than really examine that they're doing that and that it's popular and that it's happening over and over and over again. Our reactions are usually reserved for the messenger as opposed to the actual message. So I would say let's just kind of keep that in mind.
Just one more, we have time. Well, we're over time, but we started a little late, so one more question, please.
Hi. So, how do I want to ask this question? There's been a reference to what's happening with the newest generation coming up in terms of their attitudes about sexuality and gender. There's also been, the women's movement has, it hasn't moved us as far as we'd like to go, but it's been around also. And if we think about the Black Power movement, the civil rights movement, and we think about Black Lives Matter right now, from what I've heard, I don't know if it's true, but that women are doing a lot of the leading right now. And I'm wondering, and power is expressed in so many different ways, and we're fighting it. There's so much going on in the world coming at us from different directions. It feels like a movie. You just want to see how it ends, right? So do you have anything to say about sort of the rise of more feminine power to replace, this more masculine power that used to dominate just about everything, and how that will change how we communicate and the medium and the message?
Wow, that's a great question. You are you're right about the Black Lives Matter, the connection. The Black Lives Matter was actually started by 3 women, so it was started by 3 mothers. So yes, that is something that in the Black Lives Matter chapters, especially in the Denver chapter 5280, it is predominantly women, and I've noticed that as well in the Sacramento chapter. And so it is the same, and I think what's happening is just my personal opinion. Watching things unfold is I feel women. These are our sons. These are our sons out there that are being brutalized. These are our sons who are being profiled. They're being stalked by police. They're being beaten. They're being shot. They're being abused. And we are tired. And we've always been tired, but we've had very little platforms to move into, to go from tired to rage to change. And women have always been involved. I don't think it's nothing new. Like I said, by the time the Black Panther Party dissolved in 1980, it was 60% women. So these platforms have always been, but I think with mobilizing and with the ideas of change, I think it's something that's able to happen more quickly. But I don't think it's necessarily women can do it better than men. I just think we're just seeing things sort of shift in that way. And I think there's just more platforms for women to finally start changing their lives of their home, and also the lives of their sons that they're trying to raise. There's a lot of single mothers out there who need assistance. For example, with the Freedom School, with the Black Lives Matter, a lot of the families are single parent homes. So mothers are looking for outlets for their children, but also looking for resources for themselves. So I see it as a way, as help is now here. So we have platforms, so it's now being taken advantage of, and that's why I think you're seeing more of it. But I don't think I wouldn't say it's necessarily new, if that's what. If that answers your question. I think it's moving toward a collective in the sense that we as women, we are not victims, and we're not going to allow our sons to be victims, and we're going to rise up and do what we can to save them. And we know that in the African American community, especially with mass incarceration, we talked about that earlier, the 13th Amendment. We had a panel talk on that with mass incarceration, with it being overwhelmingly Black, and with our young youth going in younger and younger and younger, we see that responsibility in our community as Black women to take charge and to step in where we are needed. It is imbalanced. And Black women are saying, we have a place in the community, and we are going to take that place, and we are going to do it with each other for now, and then we're going to come together with our youth and the men that we need to come up and bring with us.
Yeah, I would say that in the hip hop and that world, there's a lot of current artists really challenging the idea of masculinity, and challenging the idea that the feminine is weak and that it's something to be ashamed of. These young brothers are using their platforms to be taken, to have pictures taken of them with purses. I mean, that's 10 years ago that would have gotten your record label pulled. You wouldn't be known, nobody would invite you anywhere. And now, some of the biggest selling artists in the world, fact of life, wear dresses, during photo shoots and have, long conversations with Rolling Stone and Vibe and all of them about like why and what why they're choosing to do that in a way that we didn't have that platform or even that permission. But what they're doing is not just, rocking, the purses and that stuff, but they're having conversations about like, this doesn't make me weak. This is not equal to anything shameful. And so they're bringing that part to the conversation as well, the equating of power, of style, of beauty, of substance with, these aesthetics. So I think that there's a lot of really positive, fun stuff happening. And of course, if you look at the older rappers and the older, hip hop heads and people out there in the culture, they're the ones pushing back really, really hard and kind of trying to keep that conversation from happening. So it's a really interesting time to be in that world. But there's a lot of cool stuff happening that is really embracing femininity and embracing women.
And that's a great lead into next year's kind of topic. Maybe you were a plant. Because I think that's a wonderful way to think about how we can conceptualize some things going into next year. Because one of the things that I would have to think about a lot harder before, you didn't ask me the question, you're asking the panel, but the whole idea of the way that gender has played out within the African American community, where there was very little distinction between the division of labor, especially during slavery, between men and women. That had a massive impact on how we function even today. That's one. And two, the other thing I wanted to point out is that I think African American women have always been at the forefront and not acknowledged. So even when we look at the Kenneth B. Clark study, you always hear Kenneth B. Clark. Until recently, we didn't realize that it was Mamie Clark who was really taking the lead, and that's a whole paper that I might write for next year. So thank you very much for coming, everybody.
I would love to see conference proceedings.
We did not plant her, I promise you that. And Dottie, I think you've just committed yourself to writing a paper for next year. All right, we're gonna hold you to that. So that is the conclusion of our this year's Black New England Conference. Can we please give all of our presenters a round of applause?